The late afternoon sun bathed Pemberton Bistro in a golden glow as diners enjoyed their meals, engaged in quiet conversations, and clinked glasses in celebration of special occasions. The elegant restaurant, known for its refined ambiance and impeccable service, was a place where people came to mark milestones and close lucrative business deals. Among the well-dressed patrons, an elderly black woman entered, her presence quiet yet commanding. Dressed in a navy blue coat with delicate embroidery along the cuffs, she carried herself with grace and dignity. A small black handbag was tucked securely under her arm, and though her steps were slow, her posture remained upright, a testament to her strength over the years. As she approached the hostess stand, a slight but noticeable tension flickered across the young woman's face. The greeting, though polite, carried an undertone of hesitation, as if questioning whether the woman belonged in such a space. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" the hostess asked, casting a brief glance over her shoulder. "Yes, under the name Mrs. Holloway," the woman responded, her voice steady and composed. After a quick scan of the list, the hostess nodded and led her to a table, one tucked away in the corner near the kitchen, far from the prime seating in the restaurant. Mrs. Holloway didn't complain. She simply took her seat, folded her hands on the table, and glanced at the menu. But soon, she noticed something unsettling. Other guests were receiving immediate and attentive service, yet she remained ignored. The waiter, Todd, barely acknowledged her, walking past her table multiple times without so much as offering a glass of water. The air carried an unspoken message, one that Mrs. Holloway had encountered before, but this time someone else was watching. Seated in the dimly lit corner of Pemberton Bistro, Mrs. Holloway observed the subtle yet undeniable signs of discrimination unfolding around her. The restaurant, known for its refined service and upscale clientele, was bustling with activity. Waiters moved efficiently, attending to patrons with warm smiles and careful attention. Glasses were refilled promptly, meals arrived steaming hot, and laughter rippled through the space. Yet, despite the restaurant's seamless service, Mrs. Holloway found herself waiting. Minutes passed, and then more, yet no one approached her. The waiter assigned to her section, a young man named Todd, walked past her table multiple times, each time avoiding eye contact, each time making it clear that she was not a priority. When he finally did acknowledge her presence, his smile was thin, his tone clipped. "Sorry for the wait," he muttered, barely glancing at her. "We're really busy right now. I'll be back in a bit to take your order." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, quickly slipping into easy conversation with another table. Mrs. Holloway remained composed, though the message was clear. She was being treated differently. Around her, other diners were beginning to notice the disparity. A young woman seated nearby leaned toward her partner and whispered, her brows furrowed. "Why hasn't that table been served yet?" Her companion shrugged, stealing a glance at Todd, who seemed completely unbothered. As more time passed, the treatment became even more apparent. A fresh glass of wine was brought to a table that had arrived after her, while her own water glass remained empty. A couple across the room stole uneasy glances in her direction, as if recognizing that something was wrong, but unsure whether to speak up. Still, Mrs. Holloway did not complain. She had encountered this kind of treatment before, the kind that wasn't loud or overt, but unmistakable in its intent. It was the kind of prejudice that revealed itself in delayed service, in indifferent glances, in the silent but deliberate choice to treat someone as less important. Todd passed her table once more, still without offering her service. His demeanor remained casual and cheerful as he took orders from other guests, his laughter light and effortless. But from across the room, a man in a navy blazer watched everything unfold with quiet intensity. His jaw tightened as Todd ignored his mother yet again. He remained silent, waiting to see just how far this would go. Across the room, a man in his late 30s sat quietly, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer, his demeanor was calm but focused, his sharp gaze fixed on the interaction, or lack thereof, between Todd and Mrs. Holloway. From the moment she walked into Pemberton Bistro, he had been watching. At first, he observed the small details, the hesitant greeting from the hostess, the way she was led to a less desirable table near the kitchen, the long stretches of time she was left unattended. But as the minutes ticked by and the slight mistreatment became more apparent, his expression darkened. To the rest of the restaurant, he appeared to be just another well-dressed diner, quietly sipping his sparkling water and minding his own business. But in reality, he was noting every dismissive glance, every delayed response, every moment Todd chose to walk past Mrs. Holloway's table without so much as a second thought. He was not just any patron, and she was not just any guest. She was his mother, and this restaurant, it was his. Elijah Holloway had built Pemberton Bistro from the ground up, pouring his heart into creating a space that reflected the values his mother had instilled in him: respect, integrity, and fairness. Every detail of the restaurant, from the menu to the decor, bore his mark. Yet, in this moment, he felt powerless as he watched his mother, the woman who had shaped him, endure a quiet but deliberate act of exclusion within his own establishment. His grip on his glass tightened as he saw Todd share a smirk with another server, as if making an unspoken joke. The anger within him simmered, slow and steady, but he did not move, yet. Elijah was not the type to react impulsively. Years in the restaurant industry had taught him the power of patience, the importance of timing. If he stepped in too soon, Todd might have room to make excuses, to claim it was all a misunderstanding. But if he waited just a little longer, the waiter would have no way to deny his actions. Elijah signaled to Dana, his restaurant manager, who approached cautiously. "Keep an eye on table 12, he said in a low, firm voice. "I want to see how Todd handles this. Don't intervene yet." Dana hesitated but nodded, understanding the gravity of his request. Elijah leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving his mother's table. He would wait, but not for long. The tension in Pemberton Bistro had become impossible to ignore. Conversations had quieted, and more diners were stealing glances at Mrs. Holloway's table, their expressions ranging from concern to quiet disapproval. Yet, Todd seemed oblivious, or perhaps emboldened, by the lack of immediate consequences. He moved effortlessly between tables, chatting with other guests, smiling warmly as he took their orders. But when he passed by Mrs. Holloway's table once more, she lifted her hand slightly, signaling for his attention. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft yet clear, cutting through the low hum of conversation. Todd paused, his expression tightening with impatience. "Yes?" he responded curtly, barely masking his irritation. Mrs. Holloway remained composed, her hands resting lightly on the table. "I'd like to place my order now, if you're not too busy," she said with a polite but knowing smile. Todd sighed audibly, rolling his shoulders as if the request were an inconvenience. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered, already turning away before she could respond. At that moment, Elijah Holloway pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, yet commanding. The energy in the room shifted instantly as he strode across the floor, his presence undeniable. The laughter and chatter at nearby tables faded as guests watched, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Elijah reached Todd just as the waiter was laughing at a joke from another table, completely unaware of the storm brewing beside him. When he finally noticed Elijah standing next to him, his face blanched. "Elijah, hey!" Todd stammered, scrambling to compose himself. "I didn't know you were here." Elijah's gaze was steady, his voice calm but laced with unmistakable authority. "I've been here," he said evenly, "and I've been watching." Todd's uneasy smile faltered. "Watching what?" Elijah's eyes flicked toward his mother's table before returning to Todd. "Watching you ignore my mother, who has been sitting there for almost 30 minutes without so much as a glass of water," he said, his voice sharper now. "Watching you serve every other table with enthusiasm while treating her like she doesn't belong." Todd opened his mouth to protest, but Elijah didn't give him the chance. "Save it," he said coldly. "There's no excuse. Everyone here has seen it." Silence hung in the air as the weight of Elijah's words settled over the restaurant. The lesson was clear. Disrespect would not be tolerated, and Todd had just sealed his fate. The silence in Pemberton Bistro was deafening. Every pair of eyes in the restaurant was now locked onto the confrontation between Elijah and Todd. Even the pianist had stopped mid-note, his fingers hovering uncertainly over the keys. Todd stood frozen, the color draining from his face as the weight of Elijah's words settled over him. He glanced toward Mrs. Holloway, who remained seated with quiet composure, her expression unreadable. Your mother," Todd stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Elijah confirmed, his tone unwavering. "The woman you've treated as an afterthought. The woman you assumed didn't deserve the same level of respect as every other guest in this restaurant." Todd swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But there was none. Everyone had seen what had transpired. There was no denying it, no brushing it off as a misunderstanding. The truth was laid bare, and now, so were the consequences. Elijah turned to Dana, the restaurant's manager, who stood nearby, watching the exchange with a tense expression. "Take over table 12, he instructed. "Make sure my mother has everything she needs, immediately." Dana nodded quickly, already moving toward Mrs. Holloway's table, her voice overflowing with apologies as she refilled the empty water glass and presented a menu with newfound attentiveness. Elijah then shifted his attention back to Todd. "We'll discuss your future here later," he said, his voice now measured but firm. "For now, you're done for the day. Go home." For a brief moment, Todd seemed as if he wanted to argue, to plead his case, but the judgment had already been made. Slowly, he untied his apron and placed it on a nearby counter. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, the heavy restaurant door swinging shut behind him. As the tension in the room slowly began to ease, Elijah crouched slightly beside his mother's chair, his stern expression softening. "You okay, Mom?" he asked gently. Mrs. Holloway smiled faintly, reaching out to pat his hand. "I'm fine, son," she replied. "You handled that well." Elijah exhaled, the weight on his shoulders beginning to lift. "I should have stepped in sooner." His mother shook her head. "No, you let him reveal his character. Sometimes that's more powerful than confronting someone right away." And with that, the lesson was set. Not just for Todd, but for everyone in the room. The story of Mrs. Holloway at Pemberton Bistro carries profound lessons about dignity, respect, and the quiet power of integrity. In life, injustice often does not appear in loud, obvious forms, but in subtle acts, delayed service, dismissive glances, and silent exclusions. These moments may seem small, but they reveal deep-seated biases that persist in society. Mrs. Holloway's calm composure and Elijah's measured response remind us that true strength lies in how we react to unfairness, not with anger, but with wisdom and action. For older generations, this story serves as a reflection on the importance of character. Respect is not given based on appearance or status, but is a fundamental right. Elijah's approach also teaches a valuable leadership lesson. A leader does not simply manage operations, but upholds values that create a just and welcoming environment for all. More importantly, it asks a vital question. How often do we witness moments of quiet discrimination and choose to look away? Whether in a restaurant, workplace, or daily interactions, we must recognize that silence can enable injustice. True change begins when we choose to stand up, speak out, and ensure that dignity and fairness are extended to everyone, regardless of who they are.